I see that there is only about 145 to 150 people have joined so far. So we're waiting. The counter is ticking as I see every second one individual is joining in.
Prasad, I think we should start.
Yeah, just one more minute. I think
Okay.
just. Okay, we should go one. We have about 150 plus people already.
That's great. So welcome everyone. This is very exciting. I am super excited to mention that we are restarting our first ever CG meetups online. And this is a great moment. We are 60 years now into ASIFA International, and anybody that is more interested in learning about ASIFA, I would highly recommend that you go check our website. We have Walt Jones, who's going to be a part of the first ECG meetup. I'm going to pass it on to Prasad, who's going to talk a little bit about what we're doing next.
Hello, everyone. My name is Prasad. I help support ASIFA India in my free time. I'm just going to briefly talk about ASIFA India and then probably then pass it to Shiva, who will talk a little bit about how you could ask questions and so on and so forth. Just so you know, this happens to be ASIFA India has been around for the last 20 years, and we've been conducting various workshops, seminars, celebrating International Animation Day, as well as we also have the awards of excellence on a yearly basis, which has been very popular over the last 20 years. And the idea is we want to be more active, try and, help support the community that's our spirit with which we do, with trying to create exposure for artists and professionals as much as possible as we move forward. So what we're going to do is, before I introduce Walt Jones and him to be speaking about it, I want Shiva to just lay some ground rules on how to ask questions and some general rules we'll follow while this webinar is on.
Thank you, Prasad, and welcome everyone to ASIFA India's renewed ECG meetup series. And today it's going to be a very interactive session. But however, we would encourage all the participants to be actively sharing their comments in the chat window. If you have any particular questions, we request you to type your questions in the Q&A window, which is in the bottom of the screen. And Walt would get to Q&A during the end of the webinar. So we request you to be patient to wait for Walt to start the Q&A. Yeah, Prasad.
All right. So before I get into talking about Walt, I just wanted to acknowledge a few people who have really worked hard to make all these things happen. First and foremost, Mr. Sanjay Kimsera, who's been an active supporter for ASIFA, and he's been doing this in trying to put this whole thing together with his resources that are available. Ramakrishna from Hyderabad, who's also been a very active supporter of ASIFA over the last 15-20 years. Then obviously Shiva, who's a very active community partner who takes part in most of the community activities, including SIGGRAPH Asia and the SIGGRAPH, the main chapter of SIGGRAPH, where he's one of the key people who help support those activities there. So I'll thank all of them for taking their time to support this. And as you know, this is all voluntary efforts. So getting down without much ado, I'm going to introduce Walt Jones. Walt Jones is a filmmaker and producer and visual effects supervisor who's been in this business of storytelling for the last 25 to 30 years. He has a background in television and film production. He prides himself in being a theatrical lighting designer, and he's also has background in software development. And in the last 17 years, he's breathing life into diverse world of digital creatures, environments, effects for music videos, feature films, and commercial projects. Walt has led projects with teams large and small around the world, and he has extensive experience in planning and executing feature films and theme park projects in US, UK, India, and China. He's worked closely with some illustrious filmmakers like Ang Lee, Bryan Singer, David Twohy, George Miller, Andrew Adamson, closer home in India with Mr. Rajamouli, Shankar, and obviously in China with Ming Hao. Uh, who, he's also and all the projects which he's contributed to, including for major studios like Warner Brothers, Universal Pictures, 20th Century Fox, Lionsgate, and Disney, and the list goes on and on. Walt has also been a part of Academy Award-winning projects like Golden Compass and the Life of Pi. So it's a great honor for us to have Walt to be presenting this topic on distributed workflows for VFX and animation. Thank you very much, Walt, for doing this. And Walt's been working with one of the pioneering companies right now, which much before the COVID crisis that happened right now, has been working with teams remotely from their houses or small offices and so forth. And these guys had the forethought to do this almost for the last 3 to 4 years with people working from their respective houses globally. So, and it'll be the reason why we thought he would be one of the great guys to present today is these guys are thought ahead of their times, and they were already doing this stuff before everybody was forced to do this over the last 4 to 5 months. So, Walt, thank you very much, and take it away.
Cool. Thank you, Prasad. Certainly very happy to be here with everybody this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever in the world you might be joining from. The fun thing about this is that, of course, it doesn't really matter where we actually physically are. We can join into this from pretty much anywhere in the world, or even possibly off of this world. I right now am in Los Angeles, although it doesn't actually matter where I am either. So anyway, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of things this morning, this evening, this afternoon, and really just kind of get into as much of the sort of flow of how this remote distributed workflow has been going for my side of things over the past few years. The basic idea here is that we want to be able to bring people in anytime, anywhere, whenever they're needed. It needs to be a very dynamic system. We don't want to rely on people being physically together in the same place. And we don't even need people who are on the same continent. At least that's really the vision that we were after in designing this system. Of course, it's a work in progress. It's not like, we implemented something, this is exactly what it is, and now we just turn the crank and, push stuff through. It's something that we are continually adjusting and kind of revising as we go through. There's certainly things that still, need tweaks. So I'm going to try to keep this relatively, I guess, informal, right? This is not a white paper. This is not a specific technical presentation. Really just kind of talking more about, the inspiration of how we're doing this, why we're doing this, and also kind of how we're doing this in practice. So this is something that we have been doing now for about 6.5 years, actually, starting from the first project that we tried to use a remote workflow on. This is definitely not specific to the kinds of things that have been happening over the past, 5-6 months. Just happens to be that we were very well prepared for how things kind of ended up shifting in the world. And we're really, I think, positioned well to handle a lot of what was happening. So without further ado, let's get into some more details on things. Basic idea here is that location doesn't matter ever. We don't care where people are. We don't care where the artists are. We don't care where production managers are. We don't care where the supervisors are. We don't care where the clients are either. It's something that we really have tried to approach everything from a completely, geographically agnostic point of view, in that anybody can be anywhere at any time. And we want to make sure that the experience is consistent regardless of where people are. So what we're doing through this is trying to take everything that's being done through a normal production pipeline, through a normal production process, and abstract it. Take everything that we can and create something that is more virtual, or at least that is not necessarily tied to a specific physical location. That's a very challenging thing to do. So a little bit of background, I guess. First, let's talk about Tau Films, just so you know who we are, where I'm kind of coming from. We created Tau kind of out of the the studio for Rhythm and Hues Malaysia, and we actually started off being remote first because we had to, because we had no other choice. The first project that we worked on as Tau Films, we didn't have a physical studio. We didn't have any servers. We didn't have a render farm. We literally had nothing available to us. We just had to get everything up and start producing content right out of the gate in a very short order. We had a very short schedule, and we needed to really get things going as quickly as possible. And so that required basically accessing people everywhere that we possibly could. Being able to get the right artists in, being able to plug them into a workflow that was going to allow them to create was very, very important. And that was really the inspiration for a lot of what we were doing. So in the last 6.5 years, we've grown quite substantially. We have a number of different physical studios that I'll talk about here in a few minutes. But at this point, we're actually fairly matured in terms of how we're dealing with a lot of this workflow. So let's talk about some of the inspirations for what we're doing on this. As I said before, the real idea behind this was being able to do things that were anytime and anywhere. Location doesn't ever matter. We want to be able to access people pretty much everywhere we can. And so we want a consistent experience for everybody, for both the clients, for myself as a supervisor, for anybody else who's involved in the process, for the artists. We want to be able to quickly get people in. We don't want it to take a lot of time to get people up to speed with things. We want them to be able to get in at any time of the day. And we really want to try to be able to get people from anywhere. The other 2 points on here that I think are really important is this idea of agility, scalability, and flexibility. This is something that was really important for us going into it, because we wanted to be able to kind of move pieces around and not just have a rigid setup, not one way of doing things. And so we, kind of, again, as I mentioned before, really wanted to take the idea of what would happen in a traditional physical production pipeline and shift that into something that was more abstract, a little bit more virtual, and definitely tied less to physical location. So the way that this has really kind of come about then is that we now are able to access people everywhere. We do have physical studios. We have physical studios in North America and in Asia, Los Angeles, Vancouver, 2 studios in India, Mumbai, Hyderabad, and then Kuala Lumpur, and also in Beijing. Most of our work is done out of North America and India, but we have the ability to really shift things around and do work wherever it makes the most sense. And a key part of this is the fact that we have a lot of people who work remotely for us. So when you start looking at where we actually have people, we pretty much cover every continent except for Antarctica. And we have people in more time zones than I can honestly count. And it's a challenge keeping track of things. So when we talk about the principles of the workflow, right, what are the things that we're really trying to do here? The first point is that communication really is everything. Nothing that we have implemented on the technology side or in terms of just the process takes the place of communication. Communication has to be at the core of every single thing that we do. And I guess maybe that seems like a fairly obvious thing to state, but it is really, really important. And I think it's something that in the development process for us, we certainly knew that going in. And I think we worked very hard to try to make that at the core of a lot of what we were doing. But time and time again, we see that as being probably the most critical thing in the process. So in terms of how we're trying to approach things, communication has to be at the core of everything that we're doing. What we're trying to do then is also treat everybody as a remote site, whether they are actually in a physical studio, whether they are a remote artist. We want to make sure that everybody is basically being treated equally. And that has to do with the consistency of the experience. That has to do with how they access things, how they work with things. We don't want to have a different kind of experience for somebody who might be in the physical studio, somebody who might be at a cafe somewhere in the world, somebody who might be, I don't know, at an airport, whatever, right? We try to make things as consistent as we possibly can. And that actually ends up being really important. It simplifies the process for onboarding people. It means that people don't have to relearn the way that they're doing things. There's one process and it's applied equally to everybody. Another thing that was really important in terms of our workflow is using existing cloud platforms wherever we can. This is something that allowed us to get up to speed fairly quickly. Of course, there is a lot of custom development that has been done that we'll get into a little bit here in a moment in terms of the pieces and the glue that holds them together and the way that the data flows through the pipeline. But we really do want to make sure that we're using as many sort of existing platforms as we can. And that, again, helps create consistency of experience. It means that we are relying on development efforts of a much larger team than we have available to us. Because as a studio, we really want to be able to focus as much as possible on creating stuff, right? On creating images, on putting stuff on the screen, on telling stories. So that's really where we want to put our efforts. Security, of course, very, very important in the process. We want to make sure that we are keeping things secure, that we don't have data that can be intercepted through the process, things that can be leaked, whatever it is. And we want to make sure, obviously, also that, from an artist standpoint, that, their work is safe, that we don't have issues with, losing things. If we have, problem somewhere, from a technical standpoint, we want to make sure that we're minimizing any kind of loss that's happening through that, which is a much larger problem when you don't have everybody on a centralized server. Abstracting whenever possible. Talked a little bit about that already. And then support, which kind of comes back into the communication thing. But this, I think to some extent ended up being a bit of an afterthought, or at least it didn't seem as obvious for us going into it. But being able to really focus on support technically and otherwise for anybody who's coming into the system, anybody who's part of the process, is incredibly important. And so we've also had to go in and really rethink how a lot of the technical support, documentation, those kinds of things are really being handled to ensure that they can be approached properly when we have people spread all over the place. So we're going to tell a little bit of a story here and talk a little bit about the characters that are in the story, and then we're going to look at how things actually work in action. I'm going to try to keep this as sort of contextual as possible. I want to talk about how we use it. I don't really want to spend a lot of time going into the technical bits because we could spend days just talking about, how all of these different pieces fit together and how the data flows and everything else like that. But I think it is really important to go in and at least look at the different things that we're using and how these kind of fit together, what roles they play in the process, and then really go in and kind of look at, from a production standpoint, how this stuff is really going to work. So we're going to talk about the ingredients. The title of this talk obviously talks about both visual effects and animation. I'm looking at this much more from a larger film perspective. This is not something that is specific to visual effects. It's not something that's specific to animation. It really can be used for any type of film production. Although obviously we're going to be pretty specific, at least in terms of the presentation, on more of the visual effects side, simply because that's the best example that I have of this working in action. All right, cool. So we had talked about this before, but human communication is probably the most important character in all of this. And the thing that has come back time and time again is that we really need to make sure that we're facilitating the communication process. We need to make sure that artists are talking to each other, that supervisors are talking to the artists, vice versa, that production management knows what's going on with things and can keep track of what is actually happening. Again, this seems like an obvious thing. It's incredibly difficult to do. And what it really comes down to is taking everything that would sort of happen naturally in a physical studio, all of these sort of chance encounters, everything that comes down from, doing rounds on a daily basis or multiple times per day, going to people's desks, seeing what's going on, understanding where the problems are, understanding what is working, what isn't working. We have to be able to do all of that in a much more abstract way. And a lot of that comes down to just being really, really proactive. And some of that comes down to how we bring artists in and making sure that everybody is empowered to be as proactive as possible with bringing up issues, with raising concerns, saying what's going on. But it's also a lot of stuff from the production management side. So when coordinators, production managers, producers are really being proactive in checking in with people, understanding where things are, understanding what's happening with everybody who's involved in the process. I think the biggest takeaway that we've had from implementing any sort of remote workflow is that all of those sort of organic things that would happen on their own in a physical studio, you actually have to go out and make them happen. And so there is a lot of check-ins with people. We do have daily status that we try and get from everybody, and we just want to make sure that we understand and we're aware of what's going on. Because when we first started doing this, it was a lot more ad hoc. It was something that didn't necessarily work very well because we would have people who might go offline for a couple of days. And that becomes very concerning when you're in the midst of deadlines, when you have deliveries that need to be made. And it's not apparent when you can't reach somebody what the issues may be. Is it because they are buried in getting things done and just aren't responding? Is it because something has actually happened, something that we need to deal with from a production standpoint because they can't get work done? Or is there something, a bigger issue happening? And so we've really just tried to increase the communication to sometimes a bit of an extreme level to make sure that everybody understands, what's happening, that there's, information going back and forth with everybody. So in terms of the actual pieces that go into this, Shotgun for us is really at the core of everything that we're doing. It's cloud centralized. It means that everything that's related to production in terms of the visuals, in terms of the data, in terms of really a lot of this stuff is all living in one database. This becomes a visual archive for us in terms of the output from shot work. It is also for reference for anything that's being received, whether it be editorial, whether it be set data, etc. It really allows us to keep track of just every single piece of stuff that's going in there. So it's our database of assets, sequences, shots, everything. We track all the status in there. We understand, what the schedules are going to be for these things. We know where they're at in the process, how much work is left to do, how much work has been done, and it just gives us a great, high level view, but also we can drill down into detail very, very quickly in terms of understanding, where things are at and being able to access things. It's also where we handle most of our production management, where we handle who's assigned to what, which artists need to take different things on, and just sort of visually, in some cases, even planning out exactly how some work is going to flow through the pipeline. And that's a big part of how we approach a lot of this stuff, is really trying to plan out, envision how a particular piece of something is going to get done, whether it be a shot, whether it be an asset, whatever it is, and making sure that we have a vision for exactly how that's going to work. So there's a lot of planning that really that goes into this process, so we can understand how things are going to work. Shotgun also is our database of all products and their status. We'll talk about products as we get more into the practice of things. And we also use it to track a lot of other things. Ticketing, we call it our ticketing system. Basically, just if there are any issues related to production, like, I don't know, your animation, the characters aren't on the floor or something like that on the ground. That would go into the ticketing system, any sort of issues, notes, those kinds of things. And even some more technical stuff, like if there's a pipeline issue in some cases, that stuff goes into the ticketing system in Shotgun as well, because then we can attach it to an existing entity like a shot, sequence, a particular project, an asset, whatever it may be. We track our deliveries in there as well. And then we also use it for a lot of client review, since everything's then part of the same ecosystem. But the most important thing for artists really is what we call TACO, which is the Tau Artist Console, which is basically what is presented to everybody when they get into the system. It's a dashboard, so it gives them a list of what assignments are, schedule, that kind of information. But it's really also the main mechanism for them accessing any of the production data. So TACO is integrated very, very deeply into Shotgun, and basically allows people to get stuff kind of back and forth. It's a layer of abstraction, so it means that we don't, like artists don't have an idea really of where the data actually lives most of the time. They're not looking at things in terms of a geographical location. They're not getting data from Los Angeles. They're not getting data from Kuala Lumpur. They're simply just getting the production data that they need. And so what that allows us to do then, again, is keep everything very non-specific to geography. It means that we're keeping a very consistent approach to things as people are in physical studios, as people are in remote locations. Everybody goes through the same system, everybody goes through the same interface, and has the ability to access all of this stuff. So TACO is pretty much what everybody interacts with. We do have an idea of subscriptions and products. The idea being that an artist will say, okay, I'm going to work on a particular shot, or I'm going to work on an asset, or whatever entity it is. And you're going to then check out a particular version of things, the subscriptions, and then you're going to do some work on it, and you're going to create new products, which may replace some of the ones that were before, or may add to them in some ways, and then that gets published out. We do have two different concepts within the publish, what we call primary and secondary. Primary are work files, anything that is sort of an original of something, right? It's the recipe, it's the actual things that the artists have been working on. Secondary is anything that's generated output. So render output, an Alembic output from animation, for example, anything else that may be created using the work files from the primaries. And the way that these are handled in the system is a little bit different. Primary publishes, primary files are automatically replicated between different servers within our system, which allows people to have faster, more easy access. Secondaries are generated actually separately in different locations, depending on the rules that are set up. So we do have some ability to kind of control how that stuff works. Spend a lot of time talking about TACO, but I'm going to keep moving because we're certainly under a time limit today. Production software, not a lot of stuff that we need to talk about here, but obviously this is an important character within our system. All of this stuff is hooked into Taco. All of this is what the artists are actually going to be interacting with as they are working. Nothing necessarily specific about how these are integrated into the system, because Taco is providing that layer of abstraction, is providing the transport mechanism to get work files to somebody's machine through an encrypted process, and then allowing them to work on them, do what they need, and then publish stuff back. And there's a lot of other stuff that isn't on that list that we do use, short list of production software. File servers, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but we're using Kuala Lumpur as the main data center. There's a number of reasons for that, but again, the physical location doesn't really matter when we get into a lot of this stuff. But we do replicate things across all of the physical locations, which just means that regardless of where people are working, they should have faster access. People who are remote are going to pull files from whichever file server is most appropriate from them. People who are in physical locations, also physical studios, same thing, just their stuff happens to be a little bit faster because they're not pulling it over the internet, they're pulling it within the actual studio. But the process, the transport mechanism ends up being pretty much the same. A big thing for us was really being able to set things up so that there's an abstraction in terms of how the actual physical locations are set up. We can online a new physical location given the hardware very, very quickly. If we're doing cloud compute, we just set that up as another location. It can be a virtual location, it can be a physical location. But it's basically just a description of how the file servers are going to work and how the data replication is handled. Having ISPs, internet throughput, obviously is very important. We've got a lot of connections, people connecting remotely, and we need to make sure that we can get stuff through pretty easily. So we started off the process using a single connection with an ISP, and then pretty soon it was apparent that we needed to have multiple locations or multiple connections to be able to really utilize things and make sure that things were going to stay up when they might be having issues or whatever else. And a lot of it is just bandwidth as well. Let's talk about workstations really quickly, because this is obviously what most of the people are going to be working with. We do have workstations that are physically in studios. We have workstations that are remote. Anybody who is working remotely is using their own workstation for the most part, connecting through a VPN, so everything is secure. And then we do also utilize quite a bit of remote desktop, VNC over SSH, to allow them to get into any of the production machines that are in physical studios. A lot of that stuff is virtual. But again, we're just trying to create as much consistency as we possibly can in this process. Depending on what kind of interactivity is required, some people prefer working on their local machines. Some people prefer working over the remote desktop. Really just kind of depends on what is best for their particular situation, where they are in the pipeline. The idea here, of course, again, is flexibility. We want to be able to give people the way that they want to work. We don't want to necessarily force a particular way of doing things on people, particularly on artists. And we also want to make sure that we're creating as much consistency for support as we can, because obviously having a whole bunch of different machines elsewhere can be challenging, to say the least. So. Other things, Slack and Zoom, very, very important for us. I actually can't say enough about how important it was to get in a unified and consistent means of communication across all of these different people scattered through multiple time zones everywhere in the world. We didn't have this to begin with. We were using a bunch of different methods for text messaging and things like that. And having everything roll over to Zoom actually completely changed the paradigm for us, to be totally honest. It put everything in one place. It meant that you could find people much more easily. You could see what time zone they were in, you knew what time of day it was, how likely they were to be awake, and really being able to get in and kind of understand exactly where the team was, and keep everybody working together through channels, through direct messages, and everything else. Direct communication whenever possible. I'm just going to quickly mention that. It ended up being a really important thing for us. Just reaching out, doing video conferences on a regular basis, really being proactive with a lot of that was very important, to say the least. Again, just making sure that everybody's on the same page, everybody understands what's going on, because nothing really can ever replace a face-to-face meeting. And that's certainly true in the virtual world as well as in the physical world. Cinesync gives us our primary review system, depending on which part of the pipeline that you're in. Certainly for anything that requires real-time synchronized review, we use Cinesync. Most of our other review is handled actually through Shotgun itself, but Cinesync is integrated pretty deeply with Shotgun. So, any playlist that we build for review, any other systems that we have set up for review can go back and forth between Cinesync and Shotgun pretty easily. And that ends up being pretty important because it means that in a Cinesync session, we can annotate, we can sketch, we can do whatever, we can add notes to things. All that stuff goes back into Shotgun. Cinesync can pull all that stuff from Shotgun. Just makes it infinitely easier to handle things when we need to do reviews. And a lot of our client review also, if we're actually physically in person with somebody, we are using Cinesync. G Suite, Google, also very, very important because it allows us to collaborate on documents, spreadsheets, etc. Like all of our, a lot of our production management stuff ends up going into Google just because it gives us a platform where, updates are all made in real time to everybody at every moment. And, we can handle pretty much anything in terms of documentation, written word anyway, spreadsheets, those kinds of things. Also, all of our calendars, email, some file sharing are within G Suite as well. Main documentation system that we're using is MediaWiki. That's pretty much for everything that is studio and production documentation. And then anything that's more on sort of the technology side of things goes through the Jira Service Desk. A lot of the technical how-tos, related information, things like that, all end up going through that system. Trello we're using to steer development. It's basically our whiteboard for a lot of the pipeline development, and pipeline department uses that quite heavily so that we can prioritize different things and kind of get an understanding of exactly what the development efforts are going to be, where we're putting priority, etc. And then last but not least, just because we're trying to mention everything that we can, Bitbucket and GitHub are also very important. Again, because they're cloud systems, they allow us to handle all of our version control, source code management, everything else for the actual glue that's holding all of this stuff together in a way that, again, can be accessed from anywhere. All right, let's talk about this stuff in action. So this is a film that we worked on last year, the release last year, called Primal. This is Nicolas Cage fighting a jaguar and doing a bunch of other badass stuff. The idea here is that we really want to have context for talking about how we're actually approaching this stuff. Because I think understanding what ingredients are going into this is great, but we want to talk about how we're actually kind of moving things around and what we're doing with this. So let's get into this. All right, starting off with script and story. This was about 2 years before final delivery on the project when we started this process. A lot of conversations with the director, myself, and other people involved in the production. And it really, of course, as it should be, was focusing on how do we tell the story? How are we going to produce this film? Like, what are we actually going to be doing here? And at this point, it's not necessarily even known exactly what the pieces are going to be. But even at this stage, we're starting to build up a database of things. We're just going into Shotgun. We're creating, at least placeholders for the things that might end up being used in the project. so that those can then flow into the production as we go. Having everything in Shotgun means that it's then immediately available to anybody in the system. If we need to do a quick test on something, if we need to actually start building an asset, if we need to do even just a quick, ZBrush sculpt model, whatever it is, having those entities in the database means that they're immediately accessible to everybody through our system, and they're accessible on Shotgun and everywhere else within the ecosystem. So we start this process pretty much, right from the beginning, even before we are necessarily, for sure on what the schedule for the project is going to be, whether the project is even going to happen. But it allows us to start figuring out what the pieces are really going to be and having these conversations. So, with Script and Story, like the director was in Vancouver for most of that. I was in Los Angeles and India and China. Bouncing back and forth for different things. But having everything in Shotgun meant that we were able to really understand where everything was, which then leads us into doing our actual visual design. So our art director was in Bulgaria at the time, and I was in Los Angeles and Beijing most of the time. Director was in Vancouver, and so we would, again, trying to use these centralized cloud systems as much as possible, put everything into Shotgun, do iterations on design work, publish things out, kick them over to the director, get his feedback. Those notes go right back into Shotgun. We understand exactly where things are at. We can mark things as approved when they're ready to go. We've got a paper trail of exactly what the process was. If there are notes that still need to be addressed, we have record of all of this. And we can really get a really good idea of exactly where things are at in the process. And everybody has access to everything. One of the sort of core tenets of how we try and approach a lot of production is that we want to get everybody who's actually doing the work, all of the artists, as close to the director, as close to any of the creative decision makers as we possibly can. And so, trying to sort of get, people out of the way, so to speak, getting myself out of the way in some cases as a supervisor, making sure that they have direct access to the notes, that they understand exactly what was said, what the issues are, what the adjustments may be, what the requests are, why things are being done. A lot of that's really important. Having everything through Shotgun and Taco also means that we have notifications. The moment that director notes go in, for example, everybody who is related to a particular asset then immediately gets notification of those. Those notes are also available within Taco. And so everything is all part of that same system. So going into asset construction, we started off the process using one of our partner studios in Seoul, South Korea, WYSIWYG Studios. Moved some of that then over to Hyderabad, Kuala Lumpur, other remote artists. We had some of the work done with people who were in Europe, and really trying to push this stuff to the people that it made sense to have do it. I think we really try and focus on having the right people in to handle things. Part of what we're able to do through this remote distributed workflow is really move things around much more dynamically because the files are constantly available sort of in the cloud, so to speak. We don't use that term, but the idea is that it can be accessed from anywhere. And so you can have multiple people collaborating on one thing as long as you have discrete pieces that you can really move around, check out, push back into the system. Really having that sort of compartmentalization, these individual pieces, makes a big difference in how we work because it does mean that we can share things, we can move things around, we can have somebody pick something up in Hyderabad, work on it for a little bit, kick it back over to somebody who's in Madrid, Spain. They can pick it up. So actually it means that things can move very, very quickly, so long as things are properly coordinated and there's proper communication, which again, communication, definitely at the core of all of this stuff. So the way that this kind of works is, we create an asset or an entity of some kind. It doesn't have to be an asset. I'm talking about assets, so we're going to talk about that here. Somebody will check out, the initial version of that. They will build an initial version of something. They'll publish that back into the system. And then from then on, people can then either take that data, check it out, modify it. If they're adding, rig, for example, textures, fur definitions, whatever it may be, and then push that back into the system. Or they can actually add some of that stuff back on top of it through sort of a package of different things. If they're actually discrete elements, then we're able to handle things that way. Remote review is definitely a big part of this. As I mentioned, we're doing most of our review, not real-time review, but any sort of dailies and things like that. We're mostly handling through Shotgun. I was actually for part of the asset construction process, I was in the desert in Jordan, which sounds like a little bit of a crazy place to be doing review, but because I had a 4G signal, I was able to get my laptop and pull data down pretty quickly, because a lot of the dailies that are created in Shotgun are actually pretty lightweight. So I was able to get stuff down, do reviews still on at least a daily basis, push those notes back up. It didn't matter where I was, as long as I had a decent enough network connection to be able to pull the dailies down and take a look at things and push the notes back up. So we have our assets built. Very exciting. In standard production process, we're doing turntables for everything. We're pushing all of this stuff back up into the system. We have a visual document of exactly what was created, in addition to the data that actually went into creating it. So now we get into our shoot, which is in Puerto Rico, in the middle of the Caribbean. The process here, again, still trying to push as much stuff back up into the system as we can, even during the shoot. So we do daily uploads of a lot of stuff to Shotgun. Taking shot lists, anything that we've done on that particular day, reference that was shot, any of the HDRI, set data, witness cameras, etc. I was doing review with the director in person because we happen to both be in the same physical space at the same time. So again, being able to pull in a lot of this data, dailies, things like that, get direct interaction, record those as video, push that stuff back up into Shotgun so everybody has access to it. It's great. And doing video conferences also is needed. Anytime we were doing scouting as possible locations, we document that, push that stuff back up into Shotgun so that everybody has access to it, everybody understands what it is that we're even talking about. Even if it's not necessarily confirmed, we're still going to try to push that stuff up into Shotgun so that everybody kind of has an idea of exactly what's happening. Any sets that are being constructed, same thing. We're photographing those in many cases as they are being built, so that everybody has access to that documentation and knows where things are headed. We will also, in many cases, do like walkthroughs. That's loud. Walkthroughs of the different sets as we're shooting, so that everybody again can see exactly what's happening on set, knows what we're doing, knows how things were set up, can start planning as much advanced as possible for how things are going to shoot. And then we're also actually taking stuff right off of the DIT as we're shooting and trying to upload that stuff back up into Shotgun so that everybody can start working with things as soon as possible, even if it's just QuickTime dailies, even if it's just simple low res stuff. We're pushing that stuff up as well. So now we actually have plates. Now we have stuff we need to ingest into the system. This stuff primarily happens in Kuala Lumpur. So we're shipping hard drives around. It's the most secure and actually the fastest way to get large amounts of data around. We get EDLs out of client editorial and trying to get that data in as cleanly as possible. In some cases, it's prepped by the client. In some cases, it's something that we actually have to do the debayering and prepping and everything else ourselves. Color is a big deal that we don't really have enough time to really get too deep into talking about, but we need to make sure that everybody's using a consistent color pipeline. ACES CG is what we generally use. It's not the best, but it's consistent. And that's really the biggest thing. regardless of who's handling DI, regardless of who's handling editorial output. It's at least something that everybody can really kind of agree on, which is the most important aspect of that. So we get a physical hard drive, we pull all this stuff in to the system, and then we're basically doing standard workflow at this point, except people are not necessarily in the same physical studio. We have tracking, match, move, prep work, everything else that's being spread out all over the place. So same process that we've talked about. People will check things out. They'll get proxy plates. We're typically creating fairly, they're decent resolution JPEGs to start the process, at least for tracking and match move. Even some of the prep work, as long as it's procedural, we can start with JPEGs because they're pretty lightweight and they can move around quickly. And then it's really just standard workflow. People do what they need to do, push it back up into the system. Everybody is able to really then access it and move further down the pipeline. To layout, we do layout pretty early in the process because we want to integrate back in with editorial. We want to make sure that we're able to understand from a story standpoint exactly what's happening. And so we get, again, from the cloud, from the system within Tau, from Taco, people are able to then, animators check out whatever shots, start blocking things out pretty early in the process. We had animators who were in, I think, 2 or 3 different continents. I think 3 continents on this particular project, who are then able to kind of pull stuff down, start blocking things out, and we'd get stuff back on a daily basis. It would then be reviewed by animation director CJ, also by myself, and then we'd also kick over to the director and also to editorial in Puerto Rico to be able to really look at the stuff and see how it was fitting into the process. So quick and dirty match move, doesn't have to be anything particularly exciting. And then doing just a quick animation blocking, make sure that we understand exactly where these characters are going to be, what they're going to be doing, drop that back into editorial, and make some decisions on things. So we would push all of the editorial, or all of the layout stuff into editorial on a fairly regular basis. Editorial was in Puerto Rico. They would send stuff back. We'd get notes from the director. I went over to Puerto Rico at one point to just sit down and go through everything, make sure everything was sort of in the right place, lock the cut, and then be able to get final turnover if there were any updates through EDLs, etc. All of that stuff was pretty much at that point then just sent over different electronic methods on the internet so that we were able to move quickly. We didn't need to get hard drives shipped again because we already had all of the footage at that point. It was just editorial updates. Moving into animation. Right, so 2 continents, many time zones. Again, there's a lot of collaboration that happens through this whole process. And so we talk about animation, but it's also obviously rigging, modeling. There's other work that needs to be done here. And so there's a lot of just data going back and forth. Key here, of course, as always, is that there's a lot of communication, that the animators are saying, here's what's happening, here's what I need. I understand what the notes are from the director. Here's what I need to make this really happen. And that there's daily meetings that are happening. Those are virtual, of course, and they can be things that are over Slack. It can be Zoom, but there at least needs to be some really good communication happening to make sure that everybody understands what's going on. And so we would do that with most departments and have a daily get together. Just it can be relatively quick. It doesn't have to be a full dailies. But get everybody together, virtually speaking, talk about here's where we're at, here's what needs to be done, and then everybody can go off. Because of the time zone, sometimes that means it happens at the end of somebody's day, maybe at the beginning of somebody's day, maybe in the middle. We certainly try and find times that are convenient. We find that our schedules shift around quite a bit in terms of meetings. We try something for a little bit, see how it works, we adjust it. But we try to find something that's going to sort of be the best for everybody in this process in terms of really fostering that kind of communication. So same process, still checking things out. There's a multi-character pipeline that allows different animators to work on different characters within the same shot, so that we can sort of work on things in parallel and really be able to be pretty efficient with the process. And then obviously remote review, still something that's very central to this. Dailies being pushed up on a regular basis. We have playlists that are generated automatically so that anybody who needs to review things is able to really go in and just look at exactly what is required in that particular time. QCing things ends up being really important because if somebody creates something and it doesn't work for somebody else downstream, it may be 24 hours before those people are able to connect. And so something that we've really tried to just instill in the process is that process, that QC. Something that we get out of actually being able to create all of the output dynamically in multiple locations is sanity checking some of this stuff. Artists are not generating their own output generally. I mean, they're submitting it, yes, but they're not generating it on their local machine or anything like that. For animation, it has to get published and put back into the system where the Olympics are actually generated. And if there's a failure for whatever reason, then that gets kicked back to the artist automatically. It's not something where the artist has to manually go in and confirm everything. So the idea is that the output all has to be generated within sort of the core servers, the render farm, the actual system itself, which just means that we're that much more confident in the output from the process. So animation tests, and then actually working on getting this stuff into the final animation stage. So we're still going back and forth with client editorial at this point, really being able to get their feedback in context. We're starting to work on character effects, simulation work for the fur, muscle, etc., as part of this process as well. Lighting. As things get deeper into the pipeline, closer to the end, we start relying quite a bit more on physical studios because it does make things more efficient, and it means that we can be more consistent in terms of how we handle color and things like that. So lighting mostly was Hyderabad and Kuala Lumpur, although we did, I think, have a few remote people who are working. Color management, like I said, I can't really go too deep into this, but just mentioning that it is a major concern, obviously. Making sure that people have some level of monitor calibration, making sure that what they see is the same thing that I see, is the same thing that DI sees, is the same thing that somebody in a physical studio sees. That's definitely something that is a big concern in this. Rendering. All happens within our systems. Same process, again, as I mentioned, for something like animation, where when things are published, then they end up getting generated on the farm. All of the output happens there. It can be synchronized to different servers, different locations within our system, so that it allows for easier access. We're doing more local reviews at this point because we do have teams that are generally in one location. So we're able to do group dailies, things that are a little less possible to do when everybody's spread out. But, for example, one of the sequence supervisors that we had leading the team in Kuala Lumpur, leading one of the teams in Kuala Lumpur, was actually in Los Angeles. And so they would connect on a daily basis. They would still run things sort of as they would normally would, but they weren't even on the same continent. So, that just runs through as much of a normal process as possible. Effects. Our effects supervisor was in Central America, in Belize. We also had people who were various other parts of the United States, like Michigan, a lot of people in Hyderabad as well, Mumbai. And, effects is a little bit different from some of the other stages in the pipeline, simply because it requires a lot more data. There's a lot more simulation work being done. For effects, we do rely more on local machines for running at least intermediate information in intermediate data, creating that. And then stuff gets pushed back up to the main servers and systems once it's a little bit further through the process, basically when it's starting to be ready for consumption. And then it goes through the normal process of being created as secondary products, and then it's replicated out to other servers and whatnot. Data optimization, trying to just minimize the amount of data that has to continually go back and forth between the core servers and the remote artists is pretty important, because it is a lot of data to try and manage. All right, compositing. Matte paintings were done in Los Angeles by an artist that we worked with here. That stuff would then go back up into the system like everything else. People, regardless of where they were for compositing, would be able to pull that down, push that into the system, into Nuke, into whatever they were working in. And same thing as what we were doing with lighting, where we had teams that were mostly in Kuala Lumpur and Hyderabad. Sequence supervisor who was in Los Angeles, connecting with them on a daily basis, making sure that they were virtually connected as much as possible, and going through the process of reviewing stuff. And at this point, at least from my standpoint as the visual effects supervisor, I'm looking at things that are mostly quick times, but also then taking in the raw output, the actual EXR files from comp, and reviewing those on a color managed system, 4K playback, wherever I was, whether that be Beijing, whether that be Los Angeles. It didn't matter where I was able to still look at things, full res, full quality, but we would use some pretty significant optimization on those EXR files, just to make them as lightweight as possible, make things move around the world as quickly as they can. So, final composite. And then last but not least, finishing, because we have to send all this stuff now back to Puerto Rico to go into DI. And this process actually, I think, really kind of showed off how quickly we could move on some of this stuff, because we were able to turn things around generally within a few hours, or certainly half a day. We would generally get notes or any issues that we had from DI, from client, at the end of the day, sort of Los Angeles time, which is right about the time that everybody is coming online in Kuala Lumpur and Hyderabad. And they were then able to work on notes, get new versions back, have those back over to Puerto Rico about the time that they went in the morning to start working on things. And so they'd get turnover basically within, or turnaround within a single night, which was pretty awesome actually, in terms of just being able to get stuff through the pipeline. We were getting quick times back from DI with the grade that they were working on. We got new LUTs in some cases. We did some new passes on just trying to readjust things as the color was kind of shifting. So that actually ended up being kind of a nice process, because it meant that we were really able to see how that was progressing. It wasn't just throwing it over and hoping that stuff still looks okay. We were getting a lot of feedback from them as well. So this whole process was happening continuously up until the point where we locked all the DI and said, okay, well, now we're going to make DCPs and be done with everything. So, whirlwind in 56 minutes, at least by my timer, of going through this entire remote workflow process. I think the big thing for us is that we really had 6 years to kind of transition and really build this stuff up. The biggest challenges that we had were really just trying to figure out data flow and how we could get stuff to everybody as quickly as possible. A lot of that comes through optimizations, making files as small as possible, making sure that we're replicating stuff in different servers around the world, so that regardless of where people are, they're able to get it relatively quickly. Again, going into just the concept of consistent experience, whether somebody's in a physical studio in Kuala Lumpur or whether somebody's in a remote location. We want to make sure that everybody is able to, not necessarily access things quite as quickly, but we want to make sure that the way that they access them and the way that they're really interacting with everybody else and the systems and everything are as consistent as possible. So, I think we've really looked at just how we can move things around, what the data flow is going to be, but it's also a matter of, how do we assign, some of the work. We want to be able to access people anywhere at any time. We want to make sure that we're using the best people possible to work on everything. But we also want to make sure that they are going to be able to access it quickly. And so, a lot of the work that goes into planning for us is really about, how do we structure the teams and how do we put things together? Where are people? A little bit of that. But it's more about when are people. We want to know what the time zones are. We want to know when people are going to be working on things, how many hours they're going to be able to put in on a daily basis, so that we can have as much sort of real-time communication as possible. We don't have, somebody send over a concern, a message, whatever it is, and then wait 12 hours to get a response on it. We want to get, people really talking as much in real time as we can. And so going back into kind of my key points here, communication really is everything. We have to work incredibly hard to make sure that everybody is talking to each other. Everybody knows exactly what's going on. And, that's not, an easy thing to do when you have people spread out all over the place. The ingredients that we talked about early on, things like Slack and Zoom obviously are really important to this, but a lot of it just comes down to being proactive, pushing dailies, making sure that those happen, making sure that everybody's talking to each other, and making sure that there's really no assumptions. If there are things that people don't understand or whatever it is, we want to make sure that people are being proactive and bringing that stuff up. We want to have every artist working really as their own producer to some extent, so that they really can take things as much through the process as possible. To support that, coordination and production management, very, very important. Being able to support everybody. So typically we'll have coordinators and production managers who are actually in multiple time zones. People who are in Europe, for example. France tends to be actually a really good time zone for a lot of things because it kind of bridges the stuff in North America with the stuff that's in Asia. So we kind of try to put production managers, again, in terms of time zones, where it makes sense to have everything coordinated properly. Flexibility, consistency in the experience, access, those kinds of things we've talked about a bit. Just going through my list here and see if there's anything else that we really want to talk about. Failing early and often is worth mentioning because we did a lot of that. We build systems, we try them, we try different workflows. They would fail, sometimes in big ways, sometimes in small ways, but then we'd end up being able to revise it. And it really was about just kind of continually keeping that vision of how we wanted to work, how we wanted people to interact, and all of that in mind as we went forward. And so I think just kind of summarize all of this, I think the thing that we've really learned out of this entire experience has been that, remote workflows, distribution of things across time zones, it's certainly challenging, but as long as you can abstract everything, as long as you can kind of keep things, equally accessible to everybody, regardless of where they physically are, regardless of, how fast that internet connection is, then everybody has the same experience and everybody's able to work together and collaborate, and we're able to really move things around quite dynamically. And there's a lot of technical details that go into how we deal with that, but in the end, it's really just how do we structure stuff in a way that is as efficient as possible. So that's about as much as we can get through, I think, in an hour. But I guess we'll open things up to questions if there are things that we want to talk about for a few minutes. But otherwise, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think thank you very much, Walt. That was very insightful. We have a lot of questions from all over the world. I think there are a good mix of students and professionals. The questions range from some questions related to the remote workflows, to color, pipelines, as well as students wanting to know a little bit about, what areas they should be focusing on. So in the interest, I'll try to compartmentalize my questions so that you can go one at a time. So there are even questions relating to how do you keep the project on budget and on track and things like that. So interesting mix of
Good.
topics which we have. So some of the questions, basic questions which start for the remote workflow is people working. There's a question from an individual from Chandigarh Skills School talking about what configurations of machines would people really need when they're working from home. Do they really need high-end machines, or are they going to be just VNCing into production machines somewhere else and working? What would you be? What would you be? What your take be for people working independently from their houses?
Well, it depends a lot on what work is being done, on the size of the production, the schedule. Unfortunately, there's a lot of variables involved in how a recommendation would really be made for a lot of that. The way that we've tried to approach things is that we don't make the actual machine, the workstation, whatever the artist has with them physically, the deciding factor in what they're able to do. In a lot of cases, we have people with just a very basic machine that's going to allow them to VNC into a remote desktop and use one of the more high-powered production machines. They may have specialized hardware, for example. A lot of the GPU rendering we're doing, we don't have an expectation that people are going to have a setup with them as a remote user that's going to allow them to really utilize that. But we have those setups within the studios, and so they can remote desktop into those machines and really be able to, get throughput pretty quickly.
Okay.
Animation requires more interactivity. Effects requires more interactivity. Lighting, in some cases, requires a little bit less interactivity, but more concern about color. And so, we really try to look at it as a kind of case-by-case thing, and it really comes down to what the artist and that particular team working on that work feels is going to be the best setup.
So would it be fair to say that it depends on also the production that they're plugging into, the company they're plugging into, or if it's a freelance or an independent project?
Of course.
Based on that, the configurations could be different because they're expected to do work at home and just submit files, or if they're plugging into a production house with established cloud platforms where it could be a different game. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that we've even approached things in recent projects, like we had a ride film that we were working on, I guess it was actually a year and a half ago now, where we created a small cluster of people working out of Germany who were sort of off on their own pipeline. They weren't really integrated in the same way. They were doing all of the work there locally because they could iterate, really, really, really fast on asset builds and things like that. And then they were still publishing things up through the system. They were still going through the normal pipeline once they kind of had pieces that they were really happy with. But because of the schedule on that project, it just required a different approach to things.
Got it. It's a mix. All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving on. Another question regarding two people wanted to speak about color pipeline. One is our good old friend who is now in Kaohsiung, Aditya. Adi has a question on how ASUS is established pipeline. His question is specific to ASUS CG. How is it working in the production workflow?
Well, we could talk really technically about a lot of details on that. I think right. We could do another few hours just talking about color pipeline stuff easily. But I think the short version of it would be that as long as we make sure that the comp scripts, in particular the nuke setups, are done properly to color standards, and that we have a decently calibrated monitor system, it's actually really pretty transparent to everybody. ASUS CG certainly has some limitations in terms of the gamut that it can produce, and in terms of how the data can kind of flow through it. But it's at least something that Nuke has a really good implementation in terms of how we can set that up within the Nuke scripts themselves. It's something that flows into other parts of the pipeline seamlessly, and you just kind of don't have to worry about it, to be honest.
Okay, fair enough. Aditya, you have Paul's email ID anyway. Write to him if you need more.
Right. If you want more details, you can ask me.
All right. So moving on. Also, okay, this related to a couple of things. One is both are related. Why, as a supervisor, sometimes how do you prioritize? How do you prioritize your things on the show in terms of what's more important, and keeping in mind budgets also?
Right. Wow, that's a huge question. How do we keep priorities in mind? A lot of it is just kind of a constant back and forth with trying to figure out what's going to kind of get us the most important questions answered as soon as possible. The way that I typically approach things like this is if there are things that are more contentious, if there are things that we think are going to change, if there are design questions that we have, we try and prioritize those things first. I think a lot of the technical aspects in terms of getting the perfect color correction and integration in a comp, for example, that stuff all gets kind of left until the last moment. We want to make sure that the characters are looking the best that they can. We want to make sure that we're telling the story the best way that we can. Going back to what I was talking about with having layout happen as early in the process as possible before we've even locked editorial, that's a big part of that, is really being able to just block stuff in, have it be super rough. I am a strong proponent of having things that are not really ready for client eyes going in front of a client, as long as I can talk them through it, or as long as somebody can talk them through it, and just make sure that they're able to really understand what they're looking at, what questions we need to try to answer right now, and how that's going to feed into the rest of the process.
All right. And so planning well in advance and trying to make sure as many things that you can procedurally scale up. Budget. How do you keep a budget?
Well, there we could do a whole session on that too. I mean, a lot of that is just, again, trying to project where things are going. And a lot of that comes from experience of saying, okay, well, here's something that seems like it might be, likely to go much longer than we'd originally planned. I think, going back to what I was talking about in terms of having everybody in the process really play as much of the role of the producer as they can, we want to empower everybody, all of the artists, all of the production managers, coordinators, et cetera, to really understand, how their work is fitting into the bigger picture, and really what the expectations are going to be. I think, there's a tendency to, try to make everything absolutely perfect. And it's definitely a case of there's a lot of things that are just good enough. And we get them to that point and then we let them go. And if there happens to be time and money left in the later part of the schedule, we can come back to it. But we don't want to spend time on things that, aren't important for the story.
Obviously, communication is the key with the producers and the studios, and basically trying to highlight all the change orders or any creative changes that come in, try to manage it as actively as possible, if possible. And sometimes it all comes down to relationships. I understand. Okay. So, Okay. So there's a few more questions. I'm going to mix a couple of professional questions with, some general questions on, so you didn't talk about Crowd, but probably anything. Is there a particular software of choice that you guys have for Crowd, or is it horses for courses kind of a thing?
We've actually been using the Houdini crowds for the past couple of years, which are finally up to a point where they're really able to kind of work the way that we've wanted them to. Back in the Rhythm and Hues days, it was all massive, because that was really the only thing that did a decent job of it. But the last release or two of Houdini crowds has actually been really quite good. So because we have Houdini integrated into the pipeline, we use that as much as we can.
Absolutely, I agree, and that's what we used to. Anyway, so going on, there's a lot of students in the mix, and in general, people who are starting their careers or doing these courses, are there general, advice that you would give them on what are the fundamental skills they should develop, and in general, how do they focus and balance that between the tools versus the fundamentals?
Right. Well, I mean, the fundamentals, I think, all come down to
You
just
might need to
art.
elaborate your fundamentals. Yeah, sorry.
Right. Well, right. And obviously this is something, there's a lot of different opinions on it. I think, what I see time and time again is that we're all in the business of storytelling. And so you have to understand how to do that. And that doesn't require specific tools. Go shoot something with your phone, whatever it is, just learn, visual storytelling. Learn how to draw, be able to communicate things visually, and also through ideas, through spoken word, through written word. All of that ends up being really, really important. I think, in terms of learning a particular piece of software, Maya is still really the standard for a lot of things. It's great to know that, but I'm of the opinion that you can teach most people kind of how to do that stuff as long as they understand the visual art side of things. As long as they understand how to tell a story, you can pretty much teach them how to use any kind of tool. So I'm not saying don't learn the tools, but you need to really have those fundamental art things in place first. You need to understand just how to communicate visually, because that's ultimately what we're doing.
So absolutely, just covers quite a few questions in one go. The focus should be understand the fundamentals, then we can always learn the tools, and the tools are important, but it's also, you can choose the tools which might be suitable for a particular project based on what you want to achieve, as long as you're generally get the fundamentals in place, then it should be good. And all right, so I guess I'll take Shiva, do you want to chip in and see if there's uh, any other question that I missed out?
Yes, Prasad. Like I have zeroed upon like a few interesting questions. First of all, thank you very much, Walt. That was like wonderful session. So I got a question from Ashish, and his question is, how do you measure the productivity drop or increase for artists? Has it gone down or up in the past 3-4 months?
For us, it hasn't, I think, really changed appreciably, to be totally honest. But that's because we were already, working this way from the beginning. So, the way that people have been interacting and the way that they've been working hasn't changed in the last 3 or 4 months. Aside from the fact that people are not in, physical studios in Hyderabad and Kuala Lumpur. But again, because we've created this consistent interface for people, consistent way of handling the production, consistent communication methods, where they are doesn't really matter. So if somebody's in isolation, it's still the same experience as if they were in a physical studio, minus the fact that there aren't a bunch of other people around. So yeah, the dynamic does change a little bit in that particular case, but for us as a studio, it's not something that we've seen really any change.
Yeah, sure. So the next question is, how does Pipeline enable non-destructive workflows between different departments, especially with remote work?
Right. So there's a few different ways that that's kind of accommodated, and it's always a balancing act, because we want to make sure that each stage of the pipeline is really responsible for what they're creating. We don't want to have, a new version of the model come out, for example, that then breaks the entire rig and automatically affects everybody else downstream, right? Things have to be packaged together in a way where they've been QC'd. We understand that they all work the way that we expect them to, and then they can go downstream to, the people who are actually going to be subscribing and using them. We do have a concept of packages, so that there is some sort of separation with some of these pieces, which means that we don't necessarily have all of these layers. I think one of the things that does tend to happen quite a bit in any pipeline, whether it's a pipeline like this or not, is that when you do have these sort of destructive workflows, right? If you have things baked out at every step of the stage, every step of the process, then it's very difficult to have changes go through. We try to do pretty much everything as procedurally as possible. It all ends up being just data, the recipe, the description of how something is going to be created. So you can change the inputs on it, reapply the same stuff, and then get out something that's new. So, the Olympics, for example, coming out of animation, those do go into a stage like effects, where simulations may be run on them. So there are some dependencies in there, but we try to minimize those as much as we can.
Very nice. Thank you all. So I have one more, like couple of more questions. How did remote pipeline actually help Tau Films to survive the COVID, the pandemic situation in the recent past? And were there any parts which were there, which were actually which perfect to help with the remote work from home facility?
From the DreamWorks pipeline?
From the Tau Films.
Okay.
How did Tau Films survive the situation?
No, basically to summarize, would there have been any difficulties for you after the COVID lockdown came in, or it was work as usual for you guys?
Well, right. The interesting thing is it was kind of work as usual. I mean, certainly because we're a hybrid, we do have people who are in physical studios. There were changes that needed to be made. We needed to have people go remote who weren't before. So I'm not going to say just nobody noticed. Certainly there was impact, but it was very, very minimal because the way that we've been working, the workflows and the technology behind it were already in place to be able to handle this. This wasn't a scramble of, trying to figure out, well, how do we get people online somewhere that we haven't before, or how do we, move what we've been doing in physical location into the remote world? Because we started off being remote, that was already part of the DNA of how we were approaching things.
Sure, Walt. So when you say you had this hybrid way of approach, even these physical satellite studios, artists, were they trying to log in remotely and work from home at time?
Okay. Exactly. So, I mean, everybody is already set up inherently to be able to work from anywhere. It's just some of them happen to be in physical studios together, which is great because it allows for better collaboration, more easy collaboration, we'll say. But it's certainly not something where we differentiate between people who are remote versus somebody who is not.
Sure, thank you. So can we take two more questions?
Sure.
Yeah. So I'll get over them quickly. So how do you use USD in your workflow? Which parts of USD help you right away? And what are the challenges of the USD integrations?
Right. Well, I will first say that I'm not fully up to speed on exactly how USD is at this exact moment. I know that we have been certainly considering it. It's something that we are looking forward to having really more integrated into what we're doing. But to my knowledge, we're not using it at a particularly deep level right now. And a lot of that is just because it's still, there needs to be more support for it. And there need to be more hooks in for certain things that we're doing. I think, I don't want to put a timeline on it, but I think within the near future, we'll be using much more of USD.
So thank you, Kual. So next question is, while working on rigid body simulations and fluid simulations, will artists get to access the high-end systems from your remote location in case if they're working on a laptop?
Yeah, for sure. And so a lot of the effects work that's done, anything that requires simulation, we've been lucky for the most part that the artists that we've been utilizing have systems, with them physically that are able to handle a lot of that stuff. But not everybody obviously has been that. So yes, they're able to remote in, use the really high powered systems in whichever physical studio location is closest to them over a secure connection. The interactivity is really pretty good. I mean, even, our effects supervisor in Central America, who does have a high powered system with him, does do remote desktop into Los Angeles, for example. And the latency is really pretty negligible. It's been quite usable. So that just allows everybody to be that much more productive.
Yeah, one last question in between while Shiva squeezes in. There are also people are talking about licensing. So how does licensing for various softwares work and things like that? How do you
Right. Well, it's all traditional, the same way it works for a physical studio. Part of having everybody on the VPN means that they're able to access the license servers. And so, we have the same challenges that any physical studio has. in that we run out of licenses and we have to manage that stuff, and we have to make sure that people are, closing down their sessions when they're not using them, so that we're able to free up those licenses and allow them
So
to
the licenses are generally with a pool that you have, and if you need to scale up, you get monthly cloud licenses or periodic licenses when you use and so on.
Right. And it does get tricky because a lot of the licenses are done by region. So, for example, India is treated as one region in terms of licensing for some software. And that gets a little bit tricky for us because we need to know where people are. We need to obviously respect how that stuff is being handled and make sure that we're putting licenses to use in the places that they're supposed to be used. So, and as much as we've spent the last, 80 some odd minutes talking about how location and geography doesn't matter, there certainly are plenty of considerations within the process.
Because
still have that.
I think people also have questions on render farms and how you scale up. Are there service providers, any service providers that you have used, or what do you look for in some of the rendering services that are out there?
Right. Well, I'm not going to necessarily mention specific services, but we've tried a number of different ones over the last few years. The ones that have been most successful for us are those that allow us to basically, carve off a certain number of physical nodes or virtual nodes and set that up for us as what's basically, at least in terms of how our system sees it, a new location. So if we, throw the switch on, I don't know, a new facility in London, I'm just going to say that off the top of my head, right? It's the same process as we would if we actually did it in the cloud and when we do it in the cloud. And so we need a platform that is typically not already set up with like a whole bunch of stuff, right? We're not going to ship files over manually and pull it up in their Maya render farm and hope that things come out the way that they're supposed to. Because of all of the sort of custom stuff that we have, that doesn't really work. But also because of the custom stuff that we have, we can flip a switch on a new virtual location with however many render nodes are required there. And it's going to function just as if all of that stuff was physically in Los Angeles or Kuala Lumpur.
To summarize, for your requirements, you'd probably looking for, a carved off number of hosts or nodes, and you'll deal with all the data management and everything because a lot of things is custom made, and that's basically what it is. Shiva, anything to end?
No, I think you just got it right about the licenses and how it works. Thank you, Prasad.
All right. I think there are a lot of questions, people. We'll try and see if we can answer some of those questions offline. And, we couldn't get through all the questions. We're sorry.
Prasad? Hello? I think there was...
But it was... Am I back? Shiva, I think
yes,
I have...
You're back. You're back.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think my bandwidth dipped. This is, again, one of the problems of working remotely. And there's a small drop in bandwidth. And I think appreciate the time. Walt was originally thinking that he's going to be in Beijing, so he agreed to this time slot. He was stuck in Los Angeles, so unfortunately he got up at 5 in the morning to do this session with us. Thank you very much, Walt. Appreciate it very much, and appreciate all the people joining in. And I hope this was beneficial, and keep looking at this space for more interesting sessions that are coming up, more like master classes and sessions that will keep coming up on ASIFA India. Thank you very much.
And just to add to you, Prasad, we request every one of you to please join and follow our ASIFA India Facebook page for all the future updates. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Walt.
Sure.
Probably
my pleasure.
Get some sleep.